Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're breaking down a fascinating and highly relevant government policy white paper authored by Alexis Heng-Boon Chin. We are looking closely at a proposal that tackles a really tough challenge in Singapore right now. It's about how to balance the vital, very real financial support for couples facing infertility with the absolute necessity of long-term fiscal stewardship. It's that classic public policy dilemma. You've got compassion on one side and the harsh reality of finite medical savings on the other. So this white paper proposes a very specific solution, raising the lifetime MediSave withdrawal ceiling for IVF from $15,000 to 25,000 Singapore dollars. But as you're going to see, there is so much more to this number than meets the eye. Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll start with the fertility funding gap, then dive into the exact math behind that $25,000 figure, explore why the funding stops at 3 cycles, look at protecting future health savings, detail what is not covered, and finally, review the balanced policy strategy moving forward.
All right, let's jump straight into Section 1, the fertility funding gap and Singapore's urgent demographic challenge.
Okay, let's dive into this. Just look at this number, 0.87. That is Singapore's projected resident total fertility rate for the year 2025. It's a dramatic drop, and honestly, it represents a pressing whole-of-government challenge. Now, a low fertility rate obviously reflects a massive, complex web of constraints, right? We're talking about housing, work intensity, people delaying childbearing, all of that. But biological infertility is a major piece of that puzzle. And assisted reproductive technology, or ART, is a proven way to address that specific biological constraint. But the white paper is super careful to note something important here. Just because this demographic challenge is urgent, it doesn't automatically mean every single fertility expense should just be drawn blindly from national medical savings. We have to really look at how that treatment is being financed.
And that brings us to the absolute core of the funding gap. Let's compare 2004 with 2025. Back in 2004, the Singaporean government set a lifetime MediSave limit of $15,000 per patient for assisted conception. Fast forward to 2025, and guess what? That limit is exactly the same. The white paper points out a critical flaw in this. When you retain an unadjusted, static 2004 monetary amount, you are basically allowing inflation to silently rewrite government policy. When a cap stays the same while the cost of medication, high-tech lab practices, and clinical treatment steadily climb year after year, the actual purchasing power of patients today gets severely eroded. So we aren't comparing the $15,000 ceiling to having zero safeguards. We are comparing an entirely obsolete 2004 amount against the economic reality of today.
Moving right along to Section 2, the math behind the $25,000 and how we go about restoring real value.
What's really fascinating here is the hard data straight from the Singapore Department of Statistics. It shows they didn't just pull this new number out of thin air. Between 2004 and 2025, the all-items consumer price index rose by 53.5%. But look at the health CPI, it rose by nearly 60%. If you take that original $15,000 and adjust it strictly for healthcare inflation, you land at roughly $23,988 today. So, this proposed $25,000 ceiling, it's just about 4.2% above that strict inflationary adjustment. The white paper justifies this very modest round number buffer because broad price indexes simply can't capture every single specific nuanced change in IVF complexity or fertility medications over 2 decades. It gives us a durable ceiling without becoming an excuse for automatic, unchecked annual increases.
To really put this erosion of purchasing power into perspective for you, consider this reality on the ground. Current estimates from providers, like Singapore General Hospital, put a single IVF treatment episode somewhere between $12,000 and $18,000 before any government co-funding kicks in. This means one single modern IVF cycle can pretty much consume the entire legacy $15,000 lifetime limit. Think about that. A policy limit that was originally designed to assist couples across an entire course of multiple treatments has been reduced over time to basically covering just one attempt. The scale has been entirely lost.
So to fix this, the white paper proposes a new step-down funding schedule designed to exhaust that $25,000 cap logically across 3 cycles. It recommends allowing up to $10,000 for the first complete cycle, $8,000 for the second, and $7,000 for the third. This maps beautifully to historical healthcare inflation while rounding the numbers into an administratively simple, clearly defined treatment course. Now, why does this step-down structure matter? Well, it directs the absolute most resources to the first cycle, which is where they're needed most, while ensuring patients aren't just left completely stranded if they happen to need a second or third attempt.
Let's look at Section 3. Why stop at 3? Establishing a meaningful boundary.
Now this brings us to what I consider the biggest plot twist of the proposal. If the demographic crisis is so severe, and the ceiling is actively being raised, why does the proposal explicitly halt funding after the third cycle? The paper highlights a fundamental distinction, and it's a quote I want to read directly. This is a financing boundary rather than a clinical ban. This is absolutely crucial to understand. The policy does not say a patient cannot attempt a fourth, fifth, or even sixth IVF cycle, not at all. It simply says that compulsory protected medical savings can no longer be used to pay for them. Patients can still pursue further cycles using their own private out-of-pocket funds. It's about setting a strict limit on the public financing mechanism, not restricting anyone's individual medical freedom.
Let's move to the science and see how this builds, because clinically speaking, we start to see very real diminishing marginal returns in IVF treatments. Studies consistently show that roughly 29 to 32% of patients achieve a live birth on their very first cycle. This is where you capture the highest prognosis margin. It's your best statistical shot. Then, cycles 2 and 3 are incredibly valuable because they allow clinicians to adjust stimulation protocols and actually learn from a patient's prior biological responses. However, once you push beyond 3 complete cycles, the prognosis becomes highly heterogeneous. Success rates after repeated failures depend heavily on highly specific individual factors, like maternal age and specific embryo development issues, rather than predictable, reliable population averages. So, capping the MediSave support at 3 cycles achieves several key strategic goals for the government. First, it perfectly aligns with recognized international benchmarks, like the UK NICE guidelines, which also recommend 3 full cycles for eligible women. Second, it helps discipline patient expectations from the get-go, and crucially, it limits the pressure for healthcare providers to endlessly inflate their fees against what would otherwise be an open-ended government entitlement. It creates a necessary, predictable boundary for everyone involved. And to make this boundary totally watertight, the white paper strictly defines what a complete cycle actually means. A complete cycle encompasses 1 ovarian stimulation episode, plus all the fresh and frozen embryo transfers that are generated by that single retrieval. This might sound like bureaucratic jargon, but it is a vital administrative safeguard. It essentially prevents clinics from artificially slicing the pie to multiply claims. It completely stops anyone from dividing up or relabeling transfer stages just to bypass that strict 3-cycle rule.
Section 4. Protecting Future Health Savings. Stewardship in a Super-Aged Society.
And this brilliantly illustrates an economic concept that the paper brings up called a temporal fiscal externality. It sounds incredibly academic, I know, but what it basically means is this. Just because MediSave is an individual personal account doesn't mean withdrawal today is completely costless to society tomorrow. If a patient aggressively depletes their medical balance today, paying for endless IVF cycles, they might not have enough savings left to meet their own medical needs in old age. And those future costs? They don't just magically vanish. They simply reappear decades later as a massive burden on family members, as unpaid hospital bills, or as a drain on state public spending.
We always have to remember the context of the national timeline here. By 2026, Singapore will have officially reached super-aged status. That means more than 21% of the entire population is aged 65 or older. By 2030, we're looking at 1 in 4 citizens. MediSave is fundamentally a system of compulsory protected savings designed to support a lifetime of chronic disease management, hospitalizations, and long-term elderly care. It is not and was never meant to be disposable income. The fiscal horizon for any MediSave policy has to be measured in decades, which is exactly what makes that 3-cycle boundary so essential for responsible long-term stewardship.
Moving on to Section 5, what is not covered? Let's talk about evidence-based exclusions.
The guiding rule for the white paper here is strict, evidence-based clinical necessity. Let's look at genetic testing as an example of this. The paper recommends that clinically indicated tests like PGTM and PGTSR should remain covered because they address clearly defined known risks of inherited diseases or structural chromosomal issues. However, routine PGTA is explicitly excluded. Now, why is that? Because even though it screens embryos, major organizations like the American Society for Reproductive Medicine point out that there is highly mixed evidence on whether it actually improves your overall chances of bringing a baby home across multiple transfers. The logic is simple. Public financing should simply not run ahead of the actual laboratory evidence.
Another major exclusion we need to highlight is elective egg freezing. While it absolutely expands reproductive autonomy for women, planned freezing fundamentally acts as a hedge against uncertain future circumstances. It does not meet the strict test of a present clinical necessity required to unlock protected MediSave funds today. The realized benefit is also highly uncertain at the exact time the money is spent. For instance, the paper cites recent U.S. data showing that, of the thousands of patients who froze their eggs between 2014 and 2016, only a staggering 5.7% actually returned to warm and use them within 5 to 7 years. Therefore, under this proposed policy, it remains unsubsidized.
Finally, Section 6, a balanced policy strategy, moving forward with safeguards.
Look, to make this $25,000 ceiling actually function effectively out in the real world, without accidentally destabilizing the healthcare system, the white paper insists on a robust set of implementation safeguards. And these safeguards are highly comprehensive. Clinics would have to document a formal prognosis review, meaning they can't just push medically futile treatments on desperate patients. Patients must get a personalized, balanced disclosure so they know exactly what they are spending from their retirement funds. The paper also calls for a national registry linking clinical data directly with financing outcomes to monitor the whole system. And importantly, for lower-income patients who might not even have $25,000 sitting in their accounts, the paper recommends targeted, means-tested grants drawn from general revenue so they don't bankrupt their future health savings today. Finally, the policy must be formally reviewed after 5 years, completely avoiding the dangerous trap of automatic, unthinking price annexation.
So, if we had to boil this entire proposal down, it rests on this one guiding principle: real value restoration without scope expansion. The policy updates an obsolete 2004 monetary limit to finally match 2025 purchasing power. It respects the fact that infertility is a very legitimate, painful medical need, but it firmly maintains clinical and fiscal boundaries by limiting the scope to 3 complete cycles and keeping unproven or elective add-ons out of the equation.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with the core tension that this white paper forces all of us to confront as a society. Does funding unlimited IVF cycles truly yield meaningful population-level demographic results for a nation? Or does it simply drain the finite, highly protected retirement funds that are desperately needed for our super-aged future? The $25,000 3-cycle ceiling aims to thread that exact needle, offering genuine compassion and real value today without compromising the stewardship of tomorrow. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep asking the hard questions.